Explaining second language learning. So, what is the second language learning? Language learning is a process of mastering of language that occurs at a formal level, namely learning in class and being taught by a teacher. There are two ways of acquiring a second language, namely attitude and aptitude. Attitude is an acquisition of language unconsciously. That is, learner acquire and understand a second language by listening and reading methods. Attitude is the conscious acquisition of a second language. So the learner must pay attention to form, understand the rules, and generally understand the language process itself. The behaviorist perspective. Behaviorist theory explains learning in terms of imitation, practice, reinforcement, or feedback on success, and habit formation. Much, much of the early research within behaviorist theory was done with laboratory animals, but the learner process was hypothesized to be the same for humans. Second language application, mimicry, and memorization. Behaviorists had a powerful influence on second and virgin language teaching, especially in North America. From the 1914 to 1917, Nelson Brooks and Robert Lado were two proponents of this perspective. Their influence was felt directly in the development of widely used audiolingual teaching materials and in teacher training. Classroom activities emphasize mimicry and memorization, and students learned dialogues and sentence patterns by heart. Because language development was viewed as the formation of habit, it was assumed that a person learning a second language would start off with the habit formed in the first language and that this habit would interfere with the new ones needed for the second language. This behavior was often linked to the conservative analysis hypothesis. However, as we see in chapter 2, researchers found that many of the errors learners make are not predictable on the basis of their first language. Not do they always make the errors that would be predicted by a simple comparison of their first and second language. This discovery led to the rejection of both constructive analysis hypothesis and behaviorism, leading to a period during which both the rule of the first language and the rule of practice in learning a second language received limited attention in both research and pedagogy. In chapter 2, we say confidence, the second language learner draw on what they already know, including previously learned language. However, we also saw that they are sometimes reluctant to transfer certain first language pattern, even when the translation equivalent would be correct. And we saw the first language inflection may become more apparent as more is learned about the second language, leading learners to see similarities that they had not perceived at an earlier stage. All this suggests that the influence of the learner first language may not simply be a matter of habit, but a more subtle and complex process of identifying points of similarity, weighing the evidence in favor of some particular figures and even reflecting about whether a certain feature seems to belong in the target language. The inactive perspective. So the next inactive perspective is research working within the UG framework also differ in their hypothesis about of feedback will affect learner knowledge of the second language. Bunny Squatch, for example, concludes that instruction and feedback change only superficial aspect of language performance and do not affect the underlying systematic knowledge of the new language. She argues that language acquisition is based on the availability of natural language in the learner environment. Otherwise, they may assume that some structure of the first language have equivalence in the second language, when in fact they not. In chapter 2, we saw a good example of this in White's study of the placement of English adverb in sentence produced by French speakers. Like in chapter 2 and studies 18 and 33, we will see some research on the effect of instruction and feedback on such language features. Next is second language application, Crescent's monitor models. So, according to the monitor hypothesis, second language users draw on what they have acquired when they engage in spontaneous communication. They may use rules and patterns that have been learned as an editor or monitor, allowing them to make minor changes and polish what the acquired system has produced. Such monitoring takes place only when the speaker or writer has plenty of time, is concerned about producing correct language, and has learned the relevant rules. Nevertheless, sorry, nevertheless, this idea about second language development were influential during a period when second language teaching was in transition from structure-based approach that emphasizes learning rules of or memorizing dialogue. So studies have also shown, however, the students may reach a point from which they fail to make further progress on some features of the second language unless they also have access to guide instruction. Some insight from learning theories developed in cognitive psychology help to explain why this may be so. Next is the cognitive perspective. So, cognitive and developmental psychologists argued that there is no need to hypothesize that humans have a language-specific module in the brain or that acquisition and learning are distinct mental processes. In their view, general theories of learning can account for the gradual development of complex syntax and for learners' inability to spontaneously use everything they know about a language at a given time. The difference lies in the circumstance of learning as well as in what the learners already know about language and how that prior knowledge shapes their perception of the new language. Next, the information processing. So, cognitive psychologists working in an information processing model of human learning and performance see second language acquisition as the building up of knowledge that can be eventually be called on automatically for speaking and understanding. Another aspect of automaticity in language processing is the retrieval of word meanings. Thus, proficient language users can give their full attention to the overall meanings of a text or conversation, whereas less proficient learners use more of their attention and process the meaning of individual words and the relationship between them. Next, usage-based learning. So, cognitive psychologists, unlike innatists, see no need to hypothesize the existence of a neurological module dedicated exclusively to language acquisition. They argue that what is innate is simply the ability to learn, rather than any specific linguistic principle. Some usage-based theory also attribute less importance to the kind of declarative knowledge that characterizes skill learning and traditional structure-based approach to second language instruction. Some of the evidence for usage-based views come from the observation about the much of the language we use in ordinary conversation or in a particular genre is predictable and to a considerable extent based on formulaic units or chunks. Next is the competition model. So, Elizabeth Bates and Brian McCrimmon describe the competition model as an explanation for both first and second language acquisition that takes into account not only language form but also language meaning and language use. Truth explored 2000 of example of language associated associated with a particular meaning. Speakers of a particular language come to understand how to use the choose the signal specific function. The cognitive perspective emphasizes the role of general human abilities to process and learn an information, including language, on the basis of experience. In recent years, the term cognitive linguistics has emerged and highlights the view that language is but one of the complex knowledge systems that humans acquire. Next, we have language and the brain. So, another area of work within but not limited to the cognitive perspective is concerned with language learning and the brain. Some of the questions investigated include whether first and second language are acquired and represent in the same areas of the brain and whether the brain processes second language input differently from first language input. Therefore, any implication of language and brain research for second language teaching are premature. Next, we have second language application, interacting, noticing, processing, and practicing. So, a number of hypotheses, theories, and models for explaining second language acquisition have been inspired by the cognitive perspective. So, the first we have the interaction of hypothesis. So, modified interaction does not always include linguistic simplification. It also includes elaboration, slower speech rate, gesture, or the provision of additional contextual cues. Some examples of conversation modifiers are like 1. Comprehension checks effort by a native speaker to ensure that the learner has understood. For example, the bus leaves at 6:30. Do you understand? The next is clarification request efforts by the learner to get the native speaker to clarify something that has not been understood. For example, could you repeat please? This requires from the learner lead to further modification by the native speaker. The last is self-repetition or paraphrase. The more proficient speaker repeats his or her sentence either partially or in its entirety. For example, she got loose on her way from school. She was walking home from school. She got loose. Something like that. Next, we had the noticing hypothesis. So Richard Smith proposed the noticing hypothesis, suggesting that nothing is learned unless it has been noticed. Noticing does not itself result in the acquisition, but it is the essential starting point. From this perspective, comprehensible input does not lead to growth in language knowledge unless the learner becomes aware of a particular language feature. The extent to which learner noticing of language feature affects their second language will come up again in our discussion of research on second language acquisition in the classroom, like in chapter 5 and 6. Next, we have input processing. So, in his research with American University student learning foreign language, Bill Van Patten observed many cases of students misinterpreting sentences. For example, as predicted by the competition model discussed earlier in the chapter, When English speaker heard sentence in Spanish, they use word order to interpret the relationship among the nouns in the sentence. In order to understand that, students need to learn that in Spanish a pronoun object often precedes the verb and that, rather than rely on the word order alone. It is essential to pay attention to whether the form of the pronoun indicates a subject or an object. Next we have processability theory. Piedmont in 1999 developed processability theory on the basis of research with, with learners of different language in a variety of settings, both instructional and informal. One important aspect of his theory is the integration of developmental sequence with first language influence. Instead, they have to develop a certain level of processing capacity in second language before they can use their knowledge of the feathers that already exist in their first language. So next we have the role of practice. So researchers are now looking more closely at how practice convert declarative knowledge to procedural knowledge and then to automatic perform. Lourdes, Lourdes Ortega has proposed three principles for practicing in the foreign language classroom that she sees as compatible with the research carried out from what she calls cognitive interactionist perspective. The first is practice. The first is practice should be interactive, and then practice should be meaningful. And the last is there should be a focus on tasks essential for. Next is the social cultural perspective. I like the psychological theory that views thinking and speaking as plural but independent process. Sociocultural theory views speaking and thinking was a tightly interwoven. Speaking and writing mediate thinking, which means that people can gain control over their mental process as a consequence of internalizing what others say to them and what they say to others. Uh, These two perspectives differ primarily in the emphasis they place on internal cognitive process. In the interaction hypothesis, the emphasis is on the individual cognitive process in the mind of the learner. So for the last, we have second language application, learning by talking. Extending Vygotsky theory to second language acquisition, Jim Lomtop and Richard Donato and others are interested in showing how second language learners acquire language when they collaborate and interact with other speakers. Traditionally, the ZPT has been understood to involve an expert and no novice. Therefore, the difference between the socio-cultural perspective and that of other researchers who also view the interaction as important in second language acquisition is that socio-cultural theorists assume that the cognitive process begins as an external socially mediated activity and eventually become internalized. Other instruction models assume that modified input and instruction provide learners with raw material that is interpreted and analyzed through internal cognitive process. So there are all of my presentation today about the explaining second language learning. Thank you for your attention. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.